The topic this evening is obviously a very controversial subject. And anyone who reads the media, both the mainstream and alternative media, will be aware that there's been a war of ideas and conclusions on this subject. And this has been going on for some time, but has intensified, particularly in the last few years, especially since the H1N1 swine flu pandemic fiasco. So before getting into the slide presentation, I'd like to explain to you a little bit of history as to how I initially gained an interest in this subject. And as a parent, along with my wife, we decided not to vaccinate our 3 children with any vaccines. And personally, I can attest to the fact that as a child, I did get all of the vaccines available. I also came down with measles and mumps and chickenpox, despite going through that regimen. None of my children ever contracted any childhood diseases. We visited homes where there were children with active measles all over their body, and they were totally immune. Natural immunity is the only true immunity. Everything else is an artificial attempt to cheat nature, and nature is never cheated. And I think you'll particularly understand that point tomorrow evening, where I focus more so than tonight on the issue of immunity, because basically if we relate to the natural world properly and treat it properly, we will have health. But if we elect to think that we can fool Mother Nature, we're only fooling ourselves. The title of tonight's presentation is Historical and Scientific Perspectives on Issues Surrounding Immunity, Infectious Disease, and Vaccination. So we will have quite a bit of interesting history to look at. And the history you're going to be exposed to is very different from what you'll read in a mainstream textbook, because it's not talked about, it's ignored or it's suppressed. Now, many years ago when I was the National Health Director with what is today the Assembly of First Nations, I attended a conference in Buffalo, New York, put on by the American Natural Hygiene Society. And while there, one of the doctors mentioned a physician who worked among Aboriginal peoples in Australia named Archie Kalakarinos. Dr. Kalakarinos had recently, authored a book entitled Every Second Child. And this book was titled Every Second Child because when he first went in as director of the Kalanibri Health Center in the Northern Territory, the death rate among Aboriginal infants and small children was at about 50%. Every second child was dying. And over a period of months, he began to investigate why this was happening. And finally, after several months of inquiry, he was shocked to discover that the reason behind these deaths was the fact that these malnourished, immune system deficient children were receiving these mass vaccine campaign programs sponsored by the government. And if the parents didn't want to do it, they would force these children to take it. And they'd run them down in Land Rovers and jump out of the vehicle and grab the child and force inoculate them or vaccinate them. And so he basically went to the government with his findings. They didn't want to hear about it. They told him to get lost, basically. And finally, when he threatened to go to the national media, they hired a team of 3 scientists to investigate his claims, one of whom was named Glenn Detman. In fact, he headed the team. And after 6 months of investigation, he jumped the fence and joined Dr. Kalakarinos against the government. And many years later, I interviewed Dr. Kalakarinos when visiting the Redfern Health Centre, which is a suburb of Sydney, Australia. And I also invited him to speak in Ottawa at Carleton University, he and Dr. Detman. So I think we'll go ahead and launch into this. One last comment, though, before we do. My younger sister is a registered nurse, though she's gone into a different field since then. She was down at the Cherokee Native American hospital in western North Carolina. And while there, she met a young man who had worked in multiple Indian Health Service hospitals throughout the United States, particularly the western U.S. And she asked him, what do you think, having been in all these hospitals, is the most serious health problem facing Native Americans? She expected one of two answers, either alcohol problems or diabetes. And the response she got was vaccine damage. You will not believe what I've seen in these hospitals and the children and the deformities and the brain damage, and he went on. So she was shocked to hear that. And so as we go into this presentation, I'm going to share some shocking material with you. So be prepared to be surprised. So we'll proceed now with the presentation. Rene Dubos, author of the book Mirage of Health, was affiliated with the Rockefeller Institute in New York. And in this book, he basically challenged the idea that Western medicine was instrumental in reversing and creating reversing infectious disease and creating improved health conditions among the general population. He said, in fact, what was causing this was improved nutrition, improved transportation, improved sanitation, greater knowledge of hygiene and education, social amelioration, they call it. And his book was not well received by the medical community. But that was an interesting observation, that when you're sitting on the beach and the tide is receding and you got this little pail and you're putting water in it, you think that you're responsible. And that little pail he was alluding to is the medical establishment. And the tide was receding not because of their little pail, but because of much larger and bigger reasons. So we now look at the issue of vaccination's possible ancient origins. There are some who've done research into this and taken the view that inoculation or variolation is a disease preventative originated way back in the early Egyptian period when priest physicians engaged in healthcare in Egypt. And ancient Egyptian medicines were quite interesting. Their potions and cures included donkey dung, fish eyes, the river mud from the Nile, the hair of camels, and fly wings. So it was a time when there was a lot of superstition intertwined with religious beliefs and magic, when this practice may well have first originated. It's also fascinating to look at the source of the modern RX symbol, the prescription symbol that is used by pharmacies and medical doctors. The RX symbol originates in the eye of Horus, who was the son of Isis and Osiris. And Horus was also the Egyptian god of war and the father of pharmacy. It's quite interesting because modern medicine claims to be making a war on disease, the war on cancer and war on this and that. The reality is that they are warring upon the human constitution. And they don't understand the processes of nature that are occurring in many of these diseases. And really it's using a bullets and bazooka and explosive approach to treating disease. So we now look at what happened before 200 BC. The practice of inoculation was carried along trade routes north and east to India. And quite fascinatingly, sacred cow worship, as you know, originated in Egypt, but it was conveyed in time to India. And much later, the practice of inoculation was taken to China as well. Exploration records going back to the 1500s speak of the Brahmins in India who practiced inoculation. And this was about the same time that the co-founder of the Jesuit order, Francis Xavier, in the first half of the 16th century, spent 10 years in India, where it is claimed that he picked up this practice from the Brahmin priests and brought it back to limited areas of southern Europe. Subsequently, Lady Montagu, who was the wife of the British ambassador to Turkey, she brought back this practice to England in the early 1700s. And she'd observed this while her husband was serving in Turkey among the Ottoman people. And over time, there were many victims of this practice of variolating with dried cow pus and putting that into the human body. In fact, the King of England, King George III, lost a son to this procedure, as did many others. Finally, in the year 1840, although this practice was still supported by the Royal College of Physicians, it was outlawed and condemned as a criminal offense by an act of Parliament in England. The practice of vaccination, which is slightly different from variolation, began actually not with Jenner in 1796, but a bit earlier with a man named Ben Jesty, who used a stocking needle to transfer cowpox lesion pus to his wife's arm, inserting it into her skin, and then repeating this procedure on his two sons. In Jenner's experiment, which was about 20 years later, he transferred cowpox pus from the hand of a woman named Sarah Nelms to the arm of a man named James Phipps, or a young man named James Phipps. This here is a medal that was struck in honor of Jenner's discovery of vaccination. It's in the German language, and basically it repeats the words of the angels when they sang over Bethlehem, glory to God in the highest. And the question really is, which God they're glorifying. You see the sort of Apis bull here with all the garlands around its neck, and an angel flying above it about to throw on another garland on the sacred cow. And it's just interesting. This particular medal is located in the Center for the History of Medicine in Boston, Massachusetts. We now come to the 19th century. And what we see here is in 1871 in Bavaria, out of 30,742 cases, 29,429 were in vaccinated persons. That's just over 95%. This information, by the way, was embodied in an article written by Dr. Charles Creighton, whose photograph you see on the screen. Dr. Creighton was at the time considered Britain's leading epidemiologist. He was a medical doctor. He wrote the history of epidemics in Britain, and this information was taken from the article that he wrote for the 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. In 1871 in Prussia, which was the highest revaccinated country in all of Europe, it had the highest death rate from smallpox of any Northern European country at nearly 70,000 persons. In Germany, all the recruits were revaccinated, and death rate from smallpox ran at 60% higher than among the civil population of the same age group for whom revaccination was not mandatory. This is, of course, referring to vaccination for smallpox, which was the first use of vaccination in Western world history. Various European epidemics occurred in Cologne in 1870, where the first unvaccinated person to contract smallpox was the 174th in order of time. At Bonn in Germany the same year, the first unvaccinated person was the 42nd, and at Linetz in 1871, the 225th, showing that vast numbers of vaccinated people contracted the disease before the unvaccinated were affected. This particular medical doctor, Walter Hadwin, delivered a public address in Gloucester, UK, January of 1896, where he describes the history of vaccination in the United Kingdom. He says, since the passing of the Compulsory Vaccination Act of 1853, Since then, we've had no less than 3 distinct epidemics. In 1857 to 59, we had more than 14,000 deaths from smallpox. In 1863 through 65, that epidemic, the deaths increased to 20,000. And as vaccination continued and expanded in the population by 1871 to 2, was the worst epidemic at all, at nearly 45,000 deaths. He said stricter enforcement led to the highest vaccination rate ever achieved in England in 1871, where 97.5% of the population was vaccinated, and it coincided with England's worst smallpox epidemic. Dr. Hadwin also was from Gloucester, and he delivered that city from a smallpox epidemic more quickly than any other British city by, number 1, ruling out all vaccination, and number 2, introducing strict measures of hygiene in isolation of the infected. It's quite a fascinating piece of history. You'll never read about it in an encyclopedia, but it happened. Now, this was a letter written by a medical doctor and published in the British Medical Journal in January of 1928. We're coming now into the 20th century. It's Dr. L.A. Perry. And he raised these challenges and nobody responded to them. And what he basically said was, smallpox is 5 times or 500% more likely to be fatal in those who are vaccinated than in those who are unvaccinated. Secondly, he said, in highly vaccinated areas, such as Bombay and Calcutta, which were then part of the British Empire, smallpox is rife, while in minimally vaccinated areas, such as Leicester, it is almost unknown. He then wanted to say 80% of the smallpox cases admitted into the hospitals have been vaccinated, and 20% admitted to hospitals are unvaccinated. Germany, which was then, at that time, the best vaccinated country in the world, has more smallpox death proportional to the population than does England. In 1919, there were 28 deaths in England, compared with 707 deaths in Germany. And then the question about vaccine success here in North America, this is in the US. Dr. William Howard Hay, speaking to the Medical Freedom Society on a bill in Congress to abolish compulsory vaccination, made these statements. He says, one of the most insane things we've advocated in medicine is to insist on the vaccination of children or anyone else for the prevention of smallpox. We were never able to prove that vaccination saved 1 man from smallpox. I know of 1 epidemic of smallpox, this is in the United States, comprising 900 and some cases in which 95% of the infected had been vaccinated, and most of them recently. And then he went on to comment, in 30 years of practicing medicine, I've run across so many histories of children who've never seen a sick day until they were vaccinated and who've never seen a well day since. And this was in 1936, he made this statement. This is quite interesting, this table. It shows that the death or mortality rates, comparing the vaccinated versus unvaccinated, are quite distinct and different. Among people in Japan, you have a nearly 27% death rate from smallpox where vaccination is occurring and was occurring. In the British Army in India, you had about 11% and nearly 9% in the British Army in other colonies. In Leicester, where there's no vaccination being practiced in the period of 1880 to 1908, you had a 5.1% fatality rate and a much lower number of smallpox cases, 5.1% fatality rate. This is also quite fascinating. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation Drs. Kalakarinos and Dr. Detman, who later joined him. What was fascinating was they traveled to the Philippine Islands and they unearthed the old records of vaccination in that country, showed it to the health officials who were shocked. They couldn't believe what they were being shown. And some of that data is in this slide. In 1907, the Vaccination Acts of England were repealed by Parliament. In 1919, England and Wales, which comprised nearly 40 million people, became one of the least vaccinated countries in the world. That year, there were 28 deaths from smallpox. Population of nearly 40 million. In the Philippines, in the very same year, with only 10 million people, about 1/4 the population level, all triple vaccinated over the prior 6 years, they registered that year over 47,000 deaths from smallpox. So how was smallpox eradicated? Any of you who know about public health will know that the World Health Organization claimed that it eradicated smallpox, and the focus was on using vaccination. Well, what's interesting, if we look at the 16 years that preceded the 1966 launching of the WHO smallpox eradication campaign, there were 38 new countries or additional countries that became free from all smallpox. So what was happening was there was a massive decline occurring worldwide in smallpox cases and deaths. And several countries were very close at that point in 1966 to having 0 cases. So they basically jumped on a wave and claimed to be causing the wave. Over 90% of children in developing world countries were never reached with the vaccine. They don't mention that, but that's a fact. And in fact, if you really understand what was happening, smallpox was eradicated by 3 synergistic mechanisms. One was a practice of isolation of the infected. Number 2 was attenuation of the virus associated with smallpox. And 3 was improvements in social factors, particularly nutrition and sanitation. I mentioned the virus becoming less pathogenic. By the early 20th century, the end of the 19th century, we had, instead of variola major, which is smallpox, we had variola minor, a mild form of smallpox linked to a less virulent form of the virus. It also was given other names such as Cuban itch, smallpox, or alestrum. And the pathogenicity of a virus is actually primarily determined by the ability of the host to resist the infection. So like, for instance, I mentioned to you that none of my children contracted any of the childhood diseases. We brought them up in a very careful lifestyle. Well, we had my sister-in-law, my wife's younger sister, visit us. And unknown to us and unknown to her, she was carrying infectious hepatitis A, which is, very contagious. It is a virus. And what was interesting was my wife and I had just flown back to the East Coast. We'd spent some time in Hawaii, and we'd flown all night. And when you fly all night, you don't sleep, and your immune system gets depleted. And so when her sister left, she was in bed for 3 weeks with hepatitis, like over 3 weeks. And none of my children who were exposed to it ever were affected. They were just totally immune. I felt a little ill for one day and it went away. But my wife did, in fact, come down with it. We had it diagnosed. She lost her appetite. She went to bed. And so that was showing me, because my wife isn't quite as strict as I am about a few things, particularly she cheats once in a while on a strict nutrition, Anyway, so she was in bed. So I talked to a local country doctor, and I said, why don't we take her over to the Winchester Hospital, which is just south of Ottawa, and give her intravenous vitamin C, 10 grams, 10,000 milligrams. So he agreed to it. So we picked it up in Ottawa, went down, strapped her up intravenous, got her set. Within 2 to 3 days, all the symptoms were gone. She was 100%. It's amazing when you work with nature what is possible, Anyway, we'll continue with the presentation here. Let's see here. Okay, theory and reality. The basic theory about vaccines providing immunity is based upon the memory T cells learning this injection, this attenuated virus or whatever is being injected, and then being able to protect you from it. Basically, you have what are called B lymphocyte cells. They respond to the infectious agent. But they depend on intelligence from memory T cells, which serve as helpers, aiding in recognizing the intruders, because they signal the B cells to produce high-affinity antibodies. So you all got that straight? It's a little bit complicated. Now what's interesting is a team of University of Chicago researchers found that memory T cells are, and I put in quotes, distressingly slow learners, requiring several generations of intensive stimulation to make a lasting impression on the T cells. And then they then state, in quotes, no vaccine trial to date has been able to produce significant numbers of memory T lymphocytes. So what they're saying is basically the theory doesn't really hold water. And the memory cells are very slow learners, and they have to be exposed again and again and again until finally they catch on, so to speak. And that was the University of Chicago research team. Now, the other interesting thing is that the Pasteur Institute in France observed that 98% of the immune response that is triggered at the early stages of an infection are non-specific. These non-specific responses have been observed following different infections by viruses, bacteria, parasites, and fungi. Now what's interesting, non-specific basically means your natural immunity is responding. And what we see is an innate or natural immune system affording 98% of early response to the infection or infectious agent that's working, while the adaptive or the memory-based response that vaccination seeks to stimulate represents only 2% of the early response. So why is so much emphasis being put upon the 2% of the response versus 98% of the response? So if you go through this lecture series this week, you'll understand how powerful the body can be and can become if we follow the laws established by the Creator, and that are the basis and the foundation of health and natural immunity. Drugs and vaccines don't even hold a candle. It's like a candle to the sunlight. There's no comparison. Dr. Shelton, who was considered sort of the father of the American natural hygiene movement in the 20th century, way back in the year 1918, had a clinic where he treated nearly 1,000 cases of the great 1918-19 flu pandemic. He treated roughly 1,000 cases, and he did not lose one case. Now, just down the street in New York City, which wasn't as polluted in those days, just down the street was a regular allopathic clinic. They were losing as many as 50 to 60% of their patients. Now, it's interesting, some recent research has shown that what was actually killing people in that particular flu pandemic was not the flu. Aspirin had recently come on the scene as a medicine. Doctors at that time had no idea what the optimum dosage was or what were safe dosage levels. And so there was a massive amount of overprescribing of aspirin to those who contracted the flu. And what happened with this large amount of aspirin going to their system was their lungs filled with fluid and they drowned. So it was actually medical treatment that was killing so many people. And Shelton made the comment, making war on disease with vaccines and toxic drugs amounts to battling down reserve life forces and fighting delusional causes and entities. It is really a war upon the human constitution. So long as medical science is hinged on pathology instead of physiology, it will sow seeds of error and disease, and it will neglect to sustain the health of the community whose peril is in proportion to its ignorance. The most prolific American woman nonfiction writer is named Ellen White. She published roughly 5,000 articles and about 40 books, translated into about 140 languages. And she made the following recommendation: let physicians teach the people that restorative power is not in drugs, but it is in nature. Disease is an effort of nature to free the system from conditions that result from a violation of the laws of health. In case of sickness, the cause should be ascertained, unhealthful conditions should be changed, wrong habits corrected, then nature is to be assisted in her effort to expel impurities and to reestablish right conditions in the system. So it's a totally different understanding of the nature of disease processes that we're talking about here. It's very distinctive. And what's interesting is, we'll talk a bit about this a little later on in some of the subsequent lectures, but Western medicine has the idea that the prevention of disease and the cure of disease are two very separate processes. But the reality is that whatever will most effectively prevent a disease will also most effectively reverse that disease. And I see that as nothing less than common sense, nothing more than common sense. Now, what about polio? We dealt with smallpox. We've all been told about the eradication of polio using vaccines and how wonderful the Salk and Sabin vaccines were. Well, interestingly, back when this was all happening, Bernard Greenberg, who was the chair of the Committee on Evaluation and Standards for the American Public Health Association, he was also a dean at the University of North Carolina in the field of public health. He provided evidence at a U.S. congressional hearing on polio vaccination, and he disputed the widespread publicizing of the Salk vaccine's effectiveness. In fact, what he basically told these congressmen was that in the late 1955, major alterations to diagnostic criteria were established, whereby all non-paralytic, quote, polio cases in the thousands were re-diagnosed and called Coxsackie or Coxsackie virus conditions, infection, and also aseptic meningitis. And this led to vastly exaggerated claims that it was the vaccine that caused the huge decline in polio, when actually all they did was rename the disease. And suddenly, these thousands of people didn't have it, the old disease. Despite greatly increased vaccination, in actually 1957 to 58, there was a 50% increase in polio, and in 58, 59, an 80% increase in paralytic cases. So the big question is, well, why did polio go away? Well, we'll get to that here. There's compelling epidemiological evidence that links the rise and the fall of polio with a widespread usage and subsequent prohibition of neurotoxins such as DDT, BHC, arsenic, and lead-based pesticides. These organochlorine pesticides, such as DDT, are closely associated with nerve damage, nervous system damage, with paralysis, and with death. In spite of repeated vaccine-based eradication efforts, polio continues to persist to this day, though they've been struggling for decades to eradicate it, in those countries where DDT is still being used. In fact, in the year 2010, last year, the highest polio rate in the world was in the country of Tajikistan, where DDT is still being commonly sold in the marketplaces by women and children for farming purposes. And in that year, 2010, there were 458 cases of polio in Tajikistan. Right next door in Kyrgyzstan, 0 cases, where there's no DDT. And over in Kazakhstan, 1 case. So you can't say it's the culture or the environment. They're all Central Asian, former Soviet Union, southern republics, just above Pakistan and India. They have very similar socioeconomic, climatologic conditions. The only explanation, it seems, is the DDT. Now let's go on here. Here we see a table which shows the polio cases in the red line skyrocketing, going way back to the year 1940, and as it climbs progressively higher and higher, and then goes to this massive decline. Now what's interesting, the dotted line behind it is pesticide production in the US, mostly these organochlorine pesticides. And you see the rise in the use of these pesticides and the decline as they became illegal. So a direct sort of epidemiological pattern. Now that's the various pesticides. Now we're going to look at just DDT itself. And again, we see the rise in polio from 1940 to the 1950s. And then we see this massive decline occurring. Likewise, DDT becomes outlawed, and down and down and down polio goes. So it seems to me to be pretty compelling epidemiological evidence as to what's causing the polio and the paralysis. Interestingly, Dr. McCormick, practicing in Toronto, found that of his patients during these polio epidemics who contracted polio, any of his patients who were eating whole grains, which has all the B complex vitamins, ever developed paralysis. So the B vitamins are very important in terms of dealing with, I think, these neurotoxins. Just an interesting sidelight. So the question is, are vaccines really working? Now what's interesting is, if we look at here in Canada, First Nations people, between the year 1997 and 2000, TB among the First Nations, on reserve, and Inuit populations was estimated at 25 times higher. That's 2,500% higher than the Canadian-born non-Aboriginal population rate. BCG is the popular vaccine used for preventing tuberculosis. It's been widely administered to Aboriginal peoples for a long time, for many decades, since way back in the middle of the 20th century. So the question is, 50 years later, why do we have a 2,500 times higher rate, 25 times higher, if this vaccine is so great? They've been administering it to generation after generation. A recent study of First Nations in Western Canada showed that disseminated BCG infection increases mortality among children with immunodeficiency disorders. And in fact, there's an increase in Aboriginal childhood deaths occurring due to the BCG vaccine. Then we have, how many of you have heard of Dr. Russell Blaylock? I see a few hands go up. He's a retired neurosurgeon, very brilliant in terms of understanding the chemistry and the workings of the brain. And he talks about the brain's immune system and how the various adjuvants in vaccines, such as thimerosal, which is about 50% mercury, and aluminum hydroxide, and other adjuvants can cross the blood-brain barrier. This causes a secretion of cytokines and chemokines. And the release of these cytokines can lead to confusion, language problems, disorientation, seizures, memory problems, somnolence. Now what's interesting is in the recent H1N1, that was a while back, a few years ago, they're finding now, and they're doing more further research on it, but a number of children are developing this sleeping sickness, where you basically you're working, walking, talking, sitting, you just fall asleep. And so that's one of the side effects of the release of these cytokines, which are triggered by these metal adjuvants such as mercury or aluminum getting into the brain. Irritability, combativeness, mood alteration, difficulty concentrating, and varied behavioral disorders. The microglia also release large quantities of glutamate and quinolinic acid, which destroy brain cells as well as their connecting processes. We'll talk a little later in the presentation about one of his papers that he did. Now, that look more deeply at these issues. Now, looking at the issue of multiple vaccines, one of the major concerns is that the vaccine schedules keep climbing and climbing. more and more are being mandated, and more vaccines are being given at the same time to these small infants. What can happen when you give too many of these vaccines at one point, you can trigger neurodegenerative processes, including destruction of the synaptic connections, the dendrites, and the onset of abnormal pathway development in the developing brain, as well as in the adult brain. Now, Blaylock makes the statement that studies have shown conclusively that this practice of administering multiple vaccines can lead to severe injury to the brain by numerous mechanisms, from the third trimester of pregnancy until the age of 2 years. A child's brain is at considerable risk from this policy. A friend of mine back in the Ottawa area is Dr. Shiv Chopra. He actually launched his career in Britain developing vaccines for a major pharmaceutical company. He later went to Health Canada, is a senior health scientist. He was there for a very long time. I think it was over 30 years. And he was finally fired because he told the truth to the Senate committee about his efforts to stop the bovine growth hormone being given to Canadian cattle. He was the one who kept trying to stop this. Paul Martin, then Prime Minister, had him fired. And what's interesting, after he was fired, they sent him a little medal for distinguished service. But what's interesting, he made this comment in a communication not very long ago, September 9, 2011. He says, quote, "Vaccine-induced adverse reactions, including autism, diabetes, cancer, allergies, and various neurological disorders, continue to mount, and more so where vaccines are used the most. For all these reasons, I refer to vaccines as cluster bombs, which when injected, explode in all parts of one's body and knock out some of the most critical organs and tissues. Therefore, my opinion on this subject is that no currently used vaccine does any good to anyone's health, and every vaccine is potentially dangerous to everyone's health." Fairly strong statement. And again, he wrote the book Corrupt to the Core, which you see on the screen with a picture of Parliament in the background. A biblical prophet 2,000 years ago looked upon the panorama of Earth's history, and he solemnly warned that a time would come when, quote, "her merchants would rule the earth, and by her sorceries were all the nations deceived." Revelation 18:23. That word sorceries is actually in the original Koine Greek, the word pharmakeia, which is where we get the word pharmacy from. A druggist, a poisoner, or a giver of potions to produce magical effects. So we see the vaccine potion, we see things that are found in vaccines such as squalene, and thimerosal, live polioviruses, et cetera, et cetera. We really need to get our principles straight. You don't get warm by swallowing ice cubes or sitting on an iceberg, nor can you get healthy by injecting disease matter and toxic adjuvants, heavy metals into the human body. A large body of historical epidemiological data shows that major declines in virtually all of the major infectious diseases occurred before the use of specific vaccines. Claims about the historical life-saving impact of artificial immunization programs are based on assumption and not fact. Here are a series of tables that I developed. Here we're looking at Canada, measles incidence, and there was a brief period, 59 to 68, when data wasn't available on this particular table, but it goes way back to the year 1935 and brings us up to the year 1983. And what you see is this massive decline. In fact, I got a pointer here. I haven't been using. I think this is it. Yeah, there it is. You see this massive decline of well over 90%, closer to 96 or 7% decline in measles incidence. Finally, the vaccines are introduced in 63 and 64. And of course, Western medicine claims they eradicated the disease, but what really eradicated it was obviously something else that we talked about a little bit earlier. Social factors. We'll see that kind of picture throughout all these slides. It's quite fascinating when we look at them. Here we see England and Wales, measles mortality, 1850 to 1965. And you see between 1850 and 1900, it didn't go down very much. But after the 20th century began, it was almost as steep as a cliff in the decline, until actually there was over 98% eradicated before the mid-1960s, the measles vaccination even began. It's pretty clear evidence, if you ask me. This is even more fascinating. This table shows the decline in two conditions, one being measles, the other scurvy. And we all know what causes scurvy, the absence of vitamin C in the diet. Okay, here we see scurvy in the yellow, and they're basically parallel. The red and the yellow are together. This is between about 1915 to 1925. And then you see this continuing decline of both conditions until by 1967, both measles and scurvy are eradicated. And that's when the vaccine programs began for measles. But that tells me that it's the dietary pattern that is the determinant, not this come lately vaccine, in the last half of the 20th century. Seems to be pretty compelling evidence. Okay, here we see tuberculosis death rates in Canada. And we're going way back to the year 1880, and very high, and it drops and drops very precipitously by the early 20th century, continues to decline. And depending on which province you're in, some provinces start using BCG in 1948, others in 54, but it was obviously much later in this decline pattern. Here we see TB in the United States. Rates per 100,000, 1900 to 1960. Massive decline again, almost about 97%, 98% decline. And again, no vaccination for TB was ever adopted in the United States. Obviously wasn't necessary. Here we see New Zealand tuberculosis, an almost identical pattern. Huge declines. Early 1950s, they finally bring in the vaccine. Here we see pertussis, which is another term for whooping cough. And here we are looking at England and Wales. And you see very high rates here in 1850, higher in 1875. By about 1880, it's at its peak, and then comes the decline, down, 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 again over 90% decline, and finally the vaccine comes in around 1950 after this huge decline has occurred. So where does the credit belong? Improved nutrition, improved sanitation, greater knowledge of basic health and health care. Again, we see a second parallel line with scurvy. Scurvy again being yellow, pertussis or whooping cough red. Huge declines occurring, almost parallel, all the way down to almost total eradication has occurred by the year 1967, with the vaccine coming in at this point, and all of that before. And again, scurvy, more vitamin C in the diet. So if it's causing a decline in scurvy, it appears to be also causing an almost identical decline in pertussis or whooping cough. Scarlet fever death rates in the United States, 1910 to 1958. Again, huge declines right down to virtually zero by 1958, from 1910 to 1958. No vaccination ever adopted in the United States for scarlet fever. These are influenza mortality or death rates in the US per 100,000, 1933 to 1965. Huge death or mortality rates, dropping, a little peak there and then dropping again. And the first widespread use of flu vaccines in the United States didn't come on the scene until the late 1980s. some decades later. Same picture for all these different diseases. The patterns are just so clear. What's interesting is the British Medical Journal published in the year 2006 this statement. This was actually written by put together by the head of the Cochrane collaboration, a man named Jefferson. And basically what he said was there's a huge or big gap between policies promoting annual flu vaccines for most children and adults and supporting scientific evidence. There's an urgent need to reevaluate these strategies. Basically he's saying that the scientific evidence doesn't support these policies. The yearly US mass flu vaccine campaign has been ineffective in preventing flu in vaccine recipients. This was published in the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons, follow-up 2006. The government of Ontario launched like a 5-year campaign to eradicate the flu, spent over $100 million of taxpayer money. The University of Ottawa team published in the journal Vaccine, after several years of this huge campaign and expenditure, made the observation, it wasn't $100 million, it was $200 million. This $200 million Ontario program was designed to reduce the incidence of flu, and this has not yet happened. In fact, flu rates went up during this period. Vaccines were useless. But it made a lot of money for the drug companies. They're pretty happy. Here, children under the age of 2, this is the Cochrane collaboration. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, all over the world there are different scientific teams that are independent from the drug companies, independent of any kind of political influence, who are supposed to be very objective. And so of all the research groups, they have the highest objectivity rating, because they're not supposed to be influenced politically. Although I did send Tom Jefferson a copy of these slides, he never did respond. He's been the head of this for many years. But what's interesting is these are reviews that they undertook. They looked at 51 different research studies covering 260,000 children, and they found that for children at the age of 2, flu vaccines are 0% effective based on those studies. This is elders living in communities and group homes, the inactivated influenza vaccine. Their conclusion, little or no effectiveness. And again, this is the Cochrane collaboration, covers 64 studies spanning over 40 years of flu vaccine campaigns. Next. BCG for tuberculosis, 0% effective. In fact, there should be a negative sign there because in this particular study published in The Lancet, which is considered the most prestigious medical journal in the world, 1996, and this was in the country of Malawi in East Africa. And what they found was that tuberculosis was higher among the 2-dose vaccinated people versus the placebo group. So in fact, the vaccine made things worse in terms of tuberculosis. Here we see another study on BCG tuberculosis, and this is very rare that a study does this, but they actually monitored these people over a period of years. It wasn't just months. And what they found was that in the starting point at 0 to 2.5 years, the vaccinated had double the incidence of tuberculosis versus the placebo group. And this was on 250,000 subjects, and it was published by the TB Research Center in Chennai, India, published in the Indian Journal of Medical Research, 1999. It was a double-blind randomized controlled trial. So the question is, why does the government of Canada still promote this vaccine among the First Nations population? And why does the First Nations and Inuit population have 25 times the TB rate? Interestingly, a mid-20th century British study that looked at the relationship of the incidence of diphtheria to the presence of antibodies, it was found there was no observable correlation between antibody count and the incidence of the disease. Researchers found people who were highly resistant with very low antibody counts and people who developed disease who had very high antibody counts. So the idea that vaccines theoretically create antibodies which protect the body did not hold up any water in this particular British study, which was published actually in a book by a doctor named Burnett called the Autoimmunity and Autoimmune Diseases. The New England Journal of Medicine published a study about the outbreak of rubella or German measles among hospital personnel, and this was back in the 1980s. And they concluded the team concluded it's important to stress that immunity or its absence cannot be determined reliable on the basis of history of the disease, history of immunization, or even history of prior serologic determination. Serologic determination meaning that the blood is responding to the vaccine and is giving evidence of immunity. Now these are some interesting studies and documentation related to different outbreaks of different diseases in different parts of the US mostly. And this is a mumps outbreak in Iowa, 2006. And here we see, interestingly, that 92% of the people who contracted mumps were vaccinated. 8% of those who developed the disease were unvaccinated. This was published by the Center for Disease Control in the MMWR. Here we see chicken pox outbreak, year 2001, not far away from here in Oregon. And what we see is 86% of the vaccinated contracted chicken pox versus 14% unvaccinated. This is published in Pediatrics in year 2004. This next study was found in the Vaccine Safety Manual. What they found is pertussis outbreaks occurred in Ohio in 1993. Pertussis remembers whooping cough. And we see 10% unvaccinated versus 90% of those vaccinated who contracted pertussis. This is in 1985 in Texas. There was a major measles outbreak. It actually happened, I believe, in Corpus Christi, Texas, in the Gulf of Mexico. Here we see 1% of the 1% of those who contracted it were unvaccinated versus 99% of those who contracted the measles had received the vaccine previously, the measles vaccine. Now we'll get away from the efficacy studies and look at some of the safety issues. This was a paper published in Lancet, volume 345, way back in the mid-90s. And what they found was measles vaccination had a link to inflammatory bowel disease, the two diseases being Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And here we see, among the unvaccinated, a very, very low rate, in the vaccinated, significantly higher rate of these two inflammatory bowel diseases. This is quite interesting. What we have here is the countries on top: Iceland, Luxembourg, Spain, Belgium, Netherlands. This is Spain, Catalonia, Spain, Madrid. These countries did not require BCG vaccine for their children enrolled in schools. These countries did require the vaccine: England, Ireland, Scotland, Denmark, Norway. And here we see diabetes rates significantly higher occurring among the groups who required the vaccine. Now, what's interesting that the doctor who did this work is an immunologist. He studied with the National Institutes of Health in the United States. His name is Bartholomew Klassen, and I know him as a friend. And he basically shared with me that given current vaccination policies of Western governments, we're going to see the diabetes rates just skyrocket. He said, in fact, right now, among the horse populations in North America, even horses that eat nothing but grass they're getting metabolic syndrome, which is a precursor to diabetes, and they're getting diabetes, these horses. And again, it's all the vaccines they're getting from their faithful veterinarians. And of course, the drug industry have detail people who push these things on doctors and veterinarians. Here we see another interesting picture. This is in Britain. And what happened is, we're looking here at pertussis coverage, immunization coverage. That represents the red lines, pertussis vaccine coverage. And here we're seeing the incidence of insulin-dependent diabetes, and that's the blue. And what we see is the percentage of pertussis coverage really dropped to a very low rate in 78 to 1982. The reason being that the study had come out showing brain damage from the vaccine, so the public got scared of the vaccine. But what we see is the vaccine confidence of the public declined, and less people were vaccinated. We see also a decline in diabetes occurring. And as confidence grew in the vaccine program, in this particular vaccine, we see the increase in diabetes occurring. And that's just looking at 2 vaccines, BCG and pertussis, let alone all the other vaccines. Here we see one of the most interesting studies I've ever come across. And what's interesting, it wasn't a government, it wasn't a hospital, it wasn't a university that did this study. It was a group of parents in the Netherlands who decided they wanted to know the truth, so they had someone with finance who could do it. It was a private study, and they wanted to determine a basic question, the answer to a basic question. The question being very simple. For children who receive the full government-mandated vaccine program, all the vaccines, are they healthier or are they sicker than children who get 0 vaccines? And you'll find that there's considerable fear in the medical community to do this kind of study. This is privately financed. Here we see the fully vaccinated in red and the totally unvaccinated in green. And here we see these different conditions. This was based on a national study in the Netherlands in the year 2004. Fever, 40 degrees Celsius or centigrade, significantly higher among children who are fully vaccinated. The level of ear infections, nearly 200% higher among the fully vaccinated. Throat inflammation looks like about 400% higher. Here we see aggressive behavior events, several 100% higher, probably 800 or 900% higher. Here we see convulsions and collapse, likewise probably about 700% greater rate. And the need for antibiotics at more than double the rate. It's quite amazing. This is another table from the same study. Frequency of a baby crying. Now what you'll find is one of the symptoms of brain inflammation after receiving a vaccine, and vaccines frequently cause brain inflammation as well as depression and chronic brain inflammation, I should say. It's sustained for a very long period. But for babies, when they get this, they cry. And it's a high-pitched cry, and sometimes they cry for days and weeks. And so we see here, the frequency of baby crying, more than double among the vaccinated. Just general sickliness, looks like about 300% higher. Nearly double the rate of eczema. Asthma and chronic lung disease, more than double the rate among the vaccinated. Allergic reactions significantly higher. Aggressive behavior higher. And difficulty sleeping higher. So again, we're seeing a pattern of general impairment of the immune system of these children taking place. We don't see their immune system being strengthened. We see it being destroyed. It's very clear. Now, this is quite fascinating, this table. This is under age 5 deaths from influenza in the United States before and after the government Center for Disease Control mandated flu vaccines in early childhood. So we see here, in 1999, we see the rate going down. By the year 2002, there were about 13 or 14 deaths that were considered flu-related among children under the age of 5 in the entire country. In that year, the latter half of 2002, the Center for Disease Control required that children should now start getting flu vaccines in the United States. The same year that's implemented, we see this massive increase in death rates to nearly 90 from this very low rate, right after this was required by the government. It's quite a shocking table when you think about it. This is another fascinating table, and in fact, after I did this, it was only like 4 months ago, a study came out, and we'll look at it. I think I gotta have it towards the end of the presentation, that shows that the more vaccines that a country administers, the higher their infant death rate. And this here, we're looking at under age 5 death rates, going back to the year 2007, at that time in history. And here we're looking at different countries in the Western world, including Japan though, which is a developed country. That number is the number of vaccines in their vaccine programs for children. We have Sweden with 11, Japan with 11, Finland with 12, Norway with 13. So what we see here is a mortality or death rate increase trend line going from a fairly low rate of less than 3 to a rate, several hundred, well, 200 to 300% higher. And what we see here is in Sweden, in Japan, and Finland, a very low rate of under age 5 deaths occurring. Is the vaccine schedules increase? Switzerland 16, Norway 13, Finland 12, Australia 27, Canada 28, United States 36. And the United States has the highest under age 5 death rate of any of these countries. Canada second, Australia third. So it's quite a telling picture as well, isn't it? Now, you may or may not have heard of VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. It's basically the program set up in the US to help compensate vaccine-damaged families. And it was actually, Congress was under pressure to do this because so many people were being injured by vaccines in the US, and they paid out, it's in the billions of dollars, I don't have the exact figure. But what's fascinating is it's a passive surveillance system. Now these are the actual words taken from the government Health and Human Services website. Underreporting is one of the main limitations of passive surveillance systems, including VAERS. The term underreporting refers to the fact that VAERS receives reports for only a small fraction of actual adverse events. So some estimate it's as low as 2%, some will be generous and say as high as 10%. But the vast bulk of reports never happen. A major reason they don't happen is most doctors, medical doctors, are trained to dismiss vaccine adverse effects. They think it's a coincidence, they think it might be some other reason, the parents have done something wrong, or the child was already sick, or they rationalize their way around thinking vaccines had anything to do with it. And they're actually trained to think that way. So most doctors will not submit reports to this system. They just won't do it. And that's why the rates are so low. It's a passive system. And what's interesting, there's a little clip I wish I could have played to you where Dr. Kalakarinos in Australia is being interviewed in a documentary. He tells the story how he discovered with this high death rate among Aboriginal infants that when he gave them the vaccines, at that point he still believed in vaccines. He didn't, as the years went on, he totally didn't about face on the issue. But when he believed in them, he found by administering high dosage vitamin C with the vaccines, it eliminated by over 90% the death rate among these Aboriginal infants. It just almost wiped out their mortality from vaccines. Because vaccines are a very powerful agent in reducing toxicity in the human system. It's incredible what it can do. We'll talk about that more later in the week. We've all heard of Gardasil, I'm sure, in the last little while. It became a sort of political hot potato in the US in the last 3-4 weeks when one of the presidential candidates publicly stated, the woman from Minnesota, stated that a mother had come to her and said her child was brain damaged or retarded due to receiving this vaccine, her young daughter. Well, it's interesting, VAERS has received 18,727 reports. So if we're generous and say that's 10%, there should have really been 180,000 reports. If we say it's 2 to 5%, there should have been 300,000 to 400,000 reports of adverse reactions. Anyhow, they estimate that it's somewhere in the range of 1 to 10%. But these are some of the conditions being reported in these adverse events reports. Brain and spinal cord inflammation, encephalitis, demyelination. Now the myelin sheath is the insulator that surrounds the nerves in our body. And basically the myelin sheath requires about 35 years to fully mature. So when a baby is born, it's in its early stages of developing, and it actually takes 3.5 decades after birth to complete its maturation, the myelin sheath. And what the vaccines are doing is they destroy the myelin sheath. It's a bit like having an electrical circuit and getting a knife out and cutting the rubber or whatever it is that's surrounding the wires, and then suddenly you're short-circuiting. You're having problems. The lights are going out. So that's what's happening with the myelin, demyelination. We also are seeing reports of psychotic disorders, blood clots in the heart, lungs, and legs, cognitive or learning disorders, speech disorders, facial palsy, loss of spinal cord function, and Guillain-Barré syndrome, as well as death reports. So quite a range of very serious conditions, if you ask me. Here we see some young women from the US who are now dead after receiving Gardasil. And as of June 22, 2011, there were 68 VAERS reports of death. Again, if it's only 10%, it should have been closer to 700. And if the percentage is lower, it could be in the low thousands. But these young women all trusted their doctors, and they're all in cemeteries today. Another interesting issue in relation to vaccines is the issue of sudden infant death syndrome. And here we see some babies that died in the year 2001 from SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. And what's interesting is in October of 2009, I spoke with Karen Schumacher. She worked with Don Richardson, and they went to the Austin, Texas morgue. And Austin's a city about the size of Vancouver. And they examined autopsy reports of infants listed as SIDS. And what they found was they wanted to know whether there was a correlation with the timing of deaths and prior vaccination. And they observed that a highly disproportionate amount of sudden infant deaths were occurring at 2, 4, and 6 months, the very same times when infants are being routinely vaccinated. And their conclusion was that if vaccines did not cause or precipitate these deaths, then the infant deaths should have been very randomly spread throughout the first 6 months of life, but that was not happening. They clustered directly around the timing of vaccinations. And the medical examiners routinely missed asking about or even considering the observable relationship between the deaths and the timing of their vaccinations. This is a study done by a woman in Australia named Vira Scheibner. Her husband, way back in the late 1980s, developed a breath monitoring instrument that could monitor stress in an infant's breathing patterns. And what they observed was that as long as 21 days after receiving a vaccine, they would go through periodic stress periods. It's sort of in this table, which you can't see here in this PDF document. But it showed that when they go through these stress breathing episodes, that it's very dangerous because they can actually stop breathing and die. Obviously, when you stop breathing, you die. And so they concluded that these they call it the nonspecific stress syndrome, that can be a critical factor in infant deaths. And it was all, they believe, related to the previous administration of vaccines, why this was happening. Another paper also published by Vira Scheibner in the Australasian College of Nutrition and Environmental Medicine. And this was the issue of shaken baby syndrome. Now, a number of doctors, including Dr. Archie Kalakarinos, other doctors I've seen have published on this in the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons, they found that the symptoms of shaken baby syndrome are identical to what happens with vaccines in these infants' bodies. And we see this epidemic of accusations against parents, and there are large numbers of people now in prison in which they're claiming that they shook their babies and killed them. And most of these parents, love their children, and I believe didn't do it. But now there obviously may be some cases where they shake them, but it's particularly infants who've been delivered with forceps, because what happens after a lot of these babies who are delivered with forceps, there is brain damage, slight brain damage and bleeding on the top of the brain as a result of that. And when they receive the vaccine, it causes a much greater release of blood in the brain area, which can precipitate death. So they're much more vulnerable. They call it pre-eclamptic and eclamptic states of the mothers, and so on. In fact, Dr. Kalakarinos testified in different court hearings in Australia about this, and he was able to have the parents exonerated. If he weren't there, they would have gone to prison. This was taken from a book, actually, Chapter 7, a book entitled Fear of the Invisible, published in the year 2008. And it's entitled The Dangerous Impurities of Vaccines. It was published in the Medical Veritas in 2008. And basically, the author met with senior scientists in the late 1990s, 1999, and regulatory scientists in the US government from the National Institutes of Health to look at the safety of vaccine manufacturing methods. And she was shocked at what they found, that there was the chicken leukosis virus in the MMR vaccine when it shouldn't have been there, that the polio vaccine sometimes contained more monkey viruses than polio viruses. And there were grave concerns also about foreign residual DNA and RNA in these vaccines contaminating them. And there was a fear that they could be causing various autoimmune disorders and cancers. And there was also DNA contamination could possibly be linked to the incidence of autism and other serious disorders. So it's quite interesting. She used the title Dangerous Impurities of Vaccines. Dr. Blaylock talks about how a lot of these impurities become permanently lodged in the human body, and they can be latent, and when our immune system gets weak as we age, we can develop very serious disease conditions, including cancer. This was the study I mentioned. Infant mortality rates regress or come down in relation to the number of vaccine doses routinely given. So the less vaccines given, the greater the regression. Is there a biochemical or synergistic toxicity? And they looked at over 30 different countries and were quite amazed at what they found. And they used a very sophisticated method for calculating this, Dr. Gary Goldman and Neil Miller. This was written by a lawyer who's been defending vaccine damage cases, and he believes that there's a justification for a federal injunction to suspend all vaccine licenses based on unreasonable health risks and causal links to chronic disease pandemics. And he basically gives the rationalization for this is that the research that the government is coming up with is biased, is poorly done, and he says the best science done on these issues are by independent researchers who are finding very serious problems with vaccines and are challenging conventional wisdom. and that their research is substantially superior. And then this is basically the abstract or introduction to the article. He goes into details in terms of explaining why the researchers who are finding the serious problems, such as links to autism, etc., are in fact providing more sound scientific research. In fact, one thing I'll be talking about later in the week when I talk about the killer diseases is the corruption that is taking place in so-called scientific medical research. There's been an enormous amount of ghostwriting going on, meaning that a professor from a university who may have nothing to do or know nothing about a particular study done by a drug company will sign his name, and it gives him a number of perks and advantages to do that, and benefits. And it makes it appear that it's an objective, independent study when it isn't. And there are even some fake medical journals have been created by some of the giant drug companies. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in corruption in the medical research field. This here is written by Chris Shah and Lucia Tom, it's a hard name, it's Croatian, Tom Genovic, I think it is. Anyway, they basically are looking at the safety of aluminum vaccine adjuvants. Now what's interesting is Dr. Shah, is actually with the University of British Columbia, and Lucia is as well. Get back to that slide. And Dr. Shah, a few years ago, did a study looking at the effects of aluminum hydroxide on mice. And what he found was quite shocking to him. He saw substantial neurodegeneration. He saw a loss of motor function. And all the students working in his lab at UBC who saw this, and what they did was they basically injected these mice with the equivalent body weight proportionally of what a human would get or an infant would get with vaccines that have aluminum as adjuvant, which is the most common adjuvant today in vaccines. And this happened to these animals. And they're all afraid of vaccines now, all these students, after seeing what it did to these mice. This is an article by Dr. Blaylock, again, Russell Blaylock, being the danger of excessive vaccination during brain development, the case for a link to autism spectrum disorders. And he makes a very strong case based upon most of the research being in the neurological medical field, which he has. He has a neurologic background. He's a former neurosurgeon. And basically, what he's saying is the linkage is very strong and very compelling. In fact, the primary study that the US government is using to say that vaccines do not cause autism was by a British researcher who about 8 months ago was indicted for massive fraud for stealing huge amounts of US government money in his research. So obviously the man is not an honest man. But nobody's talking about the fact that it's his research that they're using to say vaccines aren't causing autism. But the linkage is very, very strong. In fact, if you go back 30, 40 years, autism almost didn't exist. And now the rates are extremely high. It's less than 1 in 100 in North America. But further research in Asia, I believe it was in Korea or Japan, I think it was Korea, they found that the autism rates are much higher than what they're saying here because they don't document it properly. So that may be as high as 1 in 60 or 1 in 50. Anyway, let's continue. This is another article on autism vaccines, vaccine injury compensation, thimerosal, and autism-related research. And a lot of people have the idea that mercury, or the trade name being thimerosal, is no longer being used in vaccines. Well, the reality is that most flu vaccines still have mercury, and they're still mandating them for children and elderly people. And one of the world's leading neurologists correlated elderly people getting flu vaccines in very rapid dementia, Alzheimer's. The linkage is very strong because the chronic brain inflammation causes eventually brain dysfunction, memory loss. So anyway, this particular study shows that basically, and this is a fantastic study, shows very, very clearly how flawed the research is, which is trying to say vaccines don't cause autism. Dr. Dr. King is probably the leading researcher on this issue in North America. He's fantastic. He's based in New Jersey. This article was the one I mentioned earlier, Incidence of Influenza in Ontario Following Universal Flu Vaccine. This is the study where they said that despite increased vaccine distribution and financial resources, the incidence of flu in Ontario has not decreased. And if you go into the paper, it says it has actually increased. Diabetes versus type 1 versus type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, opposite extremes of an immune spectrum disorder induced by vaccines. Now what's interesting is Dr. Klassen, I mentioned his work earlier, he found that, that type 2 diabetes is more frequent due to vaccines in Asian and North American Native or American Indian Inuit populations, whereas type 1 diabetes is more common among Caucasian people as a result of vaccines. But he said what's now happening is some people are actually developing both type 1 and type 2 diabetes simultaneously. And the medical community's puzzled why this is happening and how on earth they're going to treat it, because the two conditions are treated quite differently. And what they found in Japan was basically type 2 diabetes in Japanese children. This was about 5 or 6 years ago, I think it was the year 2004. The Japanese government withdrew the requirement that school children had to receive the BCG vaccine for tuberculosis. They withdrew it, and within a very short time, the type 2 diabetes rate among children dropped by about 50% after the Japanese government withdrew that vaccine from children. Okay, let's see. This article by Dr. Blaylock, Vaccines, Depression, and Neurodegeneration after age 50 years, another reason to avoid the recommended vaccines. And he goes again into the chronic inflammation, the immune overreactivity that takes place, and the excitotoxicity that happens, and the behavioral disorders, the loss of memory, social isolation, depression, anxiety, loss of appetite, all these things are coming about as a result of elderly people getting their annual flu shots. And I guess that's the end of the slide presentation. So I thank you for your time, and I hope this has been helpful and enlightening. It's a little frightening when we realize how serious these issues are, but I would tell you this, that we need to go back to basics. We need to understand nature and work with nature and not think that we can engage in a war against nature and win. There's a fundamental flaw in the thinking of conventional medicine, thinking that it can rise above the laws of life and nature and create artificial immunity, when in fact what it's creating is havoc and death and destruction on a scale, I think, unimaginable. Thank you.